President and Chief Advancement Officer at St. Anselm. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. College Advancement is committed to keeping our alumni and friends engaged with the college by offering webinars, podcasts, and fun social media challenges. Be sure to keep an eye out for our weekly Anselmian Connections email that lists upcoming events and opportunities for all of us to stay connected with the Hilltop. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the college's website for those who couldn't make it live today. There is a Q&A button on your screen to submit questions. Please don't be shy. I know I won't be. Now I'd like to introduce Neil Levesque, Executive Director of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. Neil has long held leadership roles in politics and governance across the state of New Hampshire. Neil joined the Institute as its Executive Director in July of 2009. Under his direction, the NHIOP's scope and exposure has grown substantially, hosting a variety of state and national productions, Politics and Eggs breakfast series, 6 presidential debates, and numerous distinguished speaker events. Neil regularly appears on news broadcasts and partners with national media outlets on political programs. It is my pleasure to welcome my good friend and colleague, Neil Levesque. Neil, take it away.
Well, thank you, Jim. Obviously, this is a little strange doing this via Zoom. I think, we're all sort of getting accustomed to the new environment. I'm not doing this from my basement, and I'm not doing this from the White House, so I'm sort of in the middle between the 2 presidential candidates right now. I am, in fact, at the Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College. The backdrop is real. It is not a fake Zoom backdrop, as you can see. So the point is what I wanted to come down here and show you is that, 2 months ago, and for the 14 months before that, this campus, this building, was just alive with all kinds of political activity, not just presidential campaign activity. We had 26 candidates at one time running around the state. That accounted for something like 22 Politics and Eggs events here. Those are sort of our signature events that go on at the Institute. We had 14 CNN town hall meetings with candidates, 5 hours one night. With many different candidates. We had, of course, the ABC debate with 700 members of the media up in one of our athletic buildings, and the debate itself taking place in the hockey arena. So it was really nonstop. And in this building in itself, we have the television studio. So all of that activity was going on down the hall from where I am right now in the West Wing. But things have changed in many different ways. And we certainly, sort of politics right now is sort of the second place to sort of the health and welfare of our loved ones. But the fact is that we still have a presidential campaign going on, and we still have a big election heading into this fall. And so we need to keep an eye on this. And certainly there's a lot of activity still going on, a lot of it via Zoom, and a lot of it sort of cloaked in our evening and afternoon coronavirus updates. I'll say this, there's a long list of many different things that this virus has brought to our country that are bad. And we'll be writing that list for a long time forward, but I will say this, that there's one good thing, and that is I think that the country has become more engaged civically, and they're certainly more knowledgeable of what's going on in politics than they ever have been before. I think things like the CARES Act are things that most Americans know exactly what the CARES Act is, how you qualify for an SBA loan, what the $600 more, how that came about in our unemployment. You're on unemployment, you've been furloughed, how long some of these programs are going to last, what the future lies as far as legislation that's going on today down in Washington. So we're about 5 weeks into this. You got to keep in mind that there's 29 more weeks until the presidential election. So think about how our attitudes have changed, politics, or how we feel about things, from grocery shopping to the supply chain, to our healthcare, to things like ventilators in the last 5 weeks, and how much they're going to change in the next 29. Years ago, and for many different years, we've always said that the stock market is like a big thermometer in presidential politics. When it's going well, usually the incumbent president will do well. The same with obviously unemployment. Now we know what's happened to the stock market, and although we're getting a lot more people, record numbers of people signing up for unemployment, there's estimations that the unemployment rate could be 10 to 20% going into the summer. That's an enormous amount, and that makes people mad. And that's going to have an impact on politics and how they feel about things like the president. But things are different now. I think that obviously you can't blame a politician for the virus. You might sort of have your own viewpoint about what their reaction was. But one thing we do know is we do know what the issues, the virus, the reaction to that, healthcare in general, and the economy, those are going to be the issues. I don't think you're going to see a lot of talk about climate change, for example, which was a really hot issue for the last year. And other issues like that, I think, are obviously going to take the back seat. The country, as we all know, is very divided, and it continues to be that way. Your opinions on how well the president has reacted to this situation really go down to how you thought about him before. And so the country really is on a razor's edge, and that really hasn't changed. But what this means is that with so much turmoil and change, we could very easily see that the public switches to one side of that razor or the other. And so things are sort of precarious. The Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, presumed Democratic candidate, has some advantages. Frankly, I think that he is sort of well suited for this Zoom environment, much more than I think some other candidates, including his opponent, are. The President of the United States loves his rallies. His staff knows that. He feeds off of that, the big crowds, versus Joe Biden, who, when he was here in New Hampshire, had very, very contained, scripted, teleprompter type events. And I think that is probably to his advantage now going into this election as to how he's campaigning. The big rallies and things like that were not something that Joe Biden was doing on a regular basis. I also think that when you're the challenger in a situation like this, you can always say, I would have responded better. I would have done a better job. And so he's got that advantage as well. Certainly, though, the president has, whether you think it's an advantage or not, he is on television every night at 6 o'clock. And the news stations are cutting right in, and you're hearing directly from him. So that is certainly to his advantage, and it's hard for Biden to get sort of this attention from his basement. Normally, you'd be able to go to Wisconsin, for example, and give a big rally and give a big speech on some issues such as climate change, and he's unable to do that. So the great unknown is what's going to change here between now and November. And there are some changes with the virus. First of all, who will vote and how will they vote? And for people in the business of politics and elections, you know, when it rains outside, that tends to lower turnout. If it's snowing, if people are not enthusiastic, that lowers turnout. Usually the lower turnout will advantage one candidate in theory or the other. And so whether or not how you're able to vote and how people feel, are they going to feel safe? Like right now, a lot of people don't feel safe going to the grocery store. Are they going to feel safe going and voting in November? That's a great unknown. Obviously, as I mentioned, I think Americans are very civically engaged right now. That will have an impact on the election. That may give us record turnouts. Will things like television ads and Facebook ads, which have always been very effective in the past, are they going to work this time? It's another one of these situations where if you're watching the president at 6 o'clock every night, you may have your own mind made up as to how good of a job he's doing and not necessarily be persuaded by a television ad that runs 30 seconds. On the television front and on the funding front, one indication of sort of an enthusiasm gap between Biden and Trump is that Biden, he took in more money this month or in this period, than any other period. He took in 46 million, but the president still took in 63. And so there is a little bit of an enthusiasm gap, and polling that came out right as this sort of pandemic came into full view indicated that there was also an enthusiasm gap. Other great unknowns, will we have debates? Debates have been amazing pivot points. The 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate usually are amazing pivot points. If we don't have those debates, our candidates going to be both standing on the stage, and we're going to be able to see which one we prefer based upon that debate. Conventions, the Democrats have already pushed back their convention, but Joe Biden has said that he may welcome having a virtual convention. I can tell you that from someone who has a daughter who's a senior in high school right now and trying to learn all day from Zoom, it's a little bit different signing on to Zoom and getting the feeling of the speaker. I'm sure you're feeling the same way right now, than it is to going to the Institute of Politics and seeing a speaker, or going to a convention and watching a live speaker as they feed off the audience. Remember that politicians have always sort of fed off of that audience. And this is such a rare indication, rare time where they don't have that. Obviously, the president right now is not doing Trump rallies. Will that change? You know, when we've had rallies here, the last one here in New Hampshire, it broke records for the state as far as our Verizon Wireless Arena in downtown Manchester, 14,000 people. This was well before anyone had heard about the coronavirus, but I can tell you that people who went and told me that you couldn't fit another person into that room. So that kind of a situation is probably not going to occur between now and November. We're also probably not going to see the kind of visits and fly-ins to states that we've seen in the past. Although little noticed by the press this week, the vice president, he did go out to Colorado, and then I believe he went to Wisconsin as well to visit 3M, or Minnesota, I should say. And so he started sort of breaking that and going on the road, and we may see more of that, where the president may feel compelled to stay in the White House and sort of be at the helm of the crisis while the vice president goes on the road and sort of picks up points, if you will, from different regions of the country. The other big factor is that we have these Senate races that are taking place in states like New Hampshire. We have a Senate race. There are 2 main Republican challengers to Senator Jeanne Shaheen, and they're barely getting any attention at all. And they're having a hard time raising funds because they can't get that attention. You can't have fundraisers. You can't get, people don't know who you are if you can't make the front page of the newspaper or the evening news. So that's another big challenge. The other aspect is, as we know here in New Hampshire, and if you're watching from New York State, you know, everyone knows who the governor of New York is these days. And likewise here in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, Governor Sununu and Governor Baker are on television every day fighting this pandemic. Quick note about those 2 governors, by the way, they both have served on the Institute of Politics Advisory Board here and are frequent visitors in the past to many of our events and different platforms that we've had. So you have a governor who now may have had a good reaction. As we've seen, Governor Sununu's numbers in New Hampshire have risen. So he may become much more popular because of the way that he led us through this challenge. And because of that, that may help Donald Trump in a state like New Hampshire. The battleground states do not include New Hampshire, although we are a purple state and our 4 electoral votes. As many of you know, if Al Gore had won the 4 electoral votes of New Hampshire, he would have become president. We would never had a Florida recount. And so they are important, and we are a toss-up state. So again, if somebody like Sununu continues to show great leadership, and the polling shows that here in New Hampshire, it might be better for President Trump and transferable to some degree. The other factor I mentioned as Cuomo is, you know, there's some polling out there that shows that a lot of Democrats believe that he should be the one who's the nominee and not Biden. There's a problem here, is that he, you know, it's nothing to do with Joe Biden. He's just not in elective office right now. And so it's actually hard for him to do a press conference every day like like the Sermons on the Mount that Cuomo is doing, and people are admiring what he's doing. His numbers have gone up, and I think a lot of people are saying, at least to pollsters, that he would make a great candidate for president. And Biden at this point is almost in his shadow. And he went to the White House yesterday to meet with the president. In a normal year like this, in an election year like this, unless there was a crisis, you wouldn't have a Democratic governor go on a high-profile visit to the president and speak highly as he has been. But we're in different times, as I mentioned. So Biden may get the question, which a lot of people ask me about, is, who is the best person to be the vice president at this point? And a lot of people are saying Cuomo. And he, in the debates before this whole virus took over, he indicated that he was going to pick a woman for vice president. And so I wonder if he's going to sort of say, I'm going to have to pick, or I will pick a governor who fits that profile, but also somebody who's been leading their state. That's why Governor Whitmer gets a lot of talk these days. I think she's been out front. And most likely, I think she'd be definitely on that short list. And she has a different advantage over, say, someone like a U.S. Senator like Harris, who, she's doing a great job in California. She ran for president, meaning she's been well vetted. She can raise a lot of money in California for the ticket, but she just doesn't have as high a profile position as a governor right now. So as far as polling goes, one thing to keep in mind right now is that a lot of polling has stopped. We have a survey center here at the Institute of Politics. We were going strong, but it means 10 students in a room sitting very close to each other. And so obviously with no students and with no one sitting close to each other, that's out. So we're actually doing a text-to-text system that we're rolling out today. Our numbers should be released by next Wednesday. That new text-to-text, if you've been following some of these campaigns, like the Trump campaign, that is the new way to communicate directly with your supporters. The FCC allows you to make these texts if you do it manually. So we actually have somebody who is pushing a button 4,000 times a day in order to text all those likely voters in New Hampshire in order to send this poll out. So that's the way we're conducting polls, but polling could be really off right now. There's less polling being done, but polling could be much more, people are kind of cranky. And so you're at home and you got other things to do. You've done your 4th Zoom call for the day with work and the phone rings and it's a pollster. So we don't know what the reaction will be on some of this, but a lot of polls that are coming out are showing nationwide snapshots. I would suggest that those don't necessarily matter. And I think, as most of us know, that the key battleground states of Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin are really where it matters. And that Trump has had, throughout the whole last year, he's had slight edges in those states. So there is some advantage with the fact that we're going off the Electoral College as we always have and not popular vote. So looking ahead, we have some pivot points. Number one, how fast do we rebound from all of this, and how fast do people look back and say, this politician handled this well, this politician did not handle this well. I have a job or I don't have a job. My wife's unemployed or she isn't unemployed. So these are sort of tipping points. So unemployment, rebound time, the blame game that's going to go around. This is America, and we argue about politics. The argument is good, but we will start to see, and we've seen a little bit of this so far, the blame game going around, and that's likely to increase as we get out of this crisis. Who the vice presidential pick is, that's going to be a big pivotal moment, I think, for the Democrats, and be very telling as far as what kind of president Joe Biden would be. And of course, the conventions and other events going into November. So that's my summation. I plan to try to be back once we have some polling numbers so that I can brief our alum on some of our polling that comes out of this polling period this week. And I'm happy to take all the Zoom questions. You can type as fast as you can on the Zoom and send me any questions. So Jim, I think, is going to read off some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil, for that, insightful overview. So the first question is from one of our alums, and they're wondering if you can tell us about your favorite candidate story from this current election cycle. And then second question, part B, is your all-time favorite story with, meeting a presidential candidate or any political figure.
Well, I have a lot of great stories regarding candidates. We spend a lot of time with them here. They're usually pretty frank with me behind the scenes. A lot of people don't realize that, behind the scenes, they're Democrats or Republicans. They're actually really great people who, for the most part, are really, really devoted towards our country. And they believe their ideas are best. It's hard to sort of disseminate that if you watch one news station or another on television. But we've had a lot of good times. I have as Jim mentioned, I started working here in 2009. My profile picture on the website, I refuse to get a new profile picture. It's a little bit different. I'd say it's about 30 pounds difference in 2009. And the staffs always print pictures of who the candidates are going to meet when they step out of the car. And so Bloomberg stepped out of the car, smiled at me and said, "You look a little different than the picture that's on the website." So I think that was kind of a funny situation. But 4 years ago and beyond that, I spent a lot of time with Donald Trump. I picked him up. I was the first person to actually drive him around the state of New Hampshire when he was running for president, with Michael Cohen, by the way, in the back seat. I got this big vehicle from my friend who owns an auto dealership. I went to the airport. I didn't realize he had a big jet that said Trump. It is so much easier picking up a candidate from the airport, or anyone from the airport. You don't have to sit in the cell phone lot when the jet comes over with the guy's name on it. So I went and picked him up and drove him around the frost heaves of New Hampshire. It was a very funny experience. And then I went to visit him in Trump Tower, which was a whole very surreal experience in itself. And I think that just to sort of say the best candidate I've been around would be Jeb Bush. I thought that he really was amazing. My daughter, when he was in our green room doing television shots all day, and my daughter, for one reason or another, didn't have school, and I brought her to the Institute. She was about 13 at the time. She went in to meet Jeb Bush, Governor Bush, who's, of course, father and brother of President of the United States. And Jeb said, "Well, Molly, you're learning politics. Who's your favorite president?" Now, I'm sitting there praying to God she doesn't say something like Bill Clinton or something like that, that she has two choices and they're both named Bush, Please, Molly, please answer a Bush. So my daughter, of course, says, "Well, of course, my favorite president is President Polk." And of course, if you're in presidential history, you like presidential history, you know that President Polk is one of these people, most people never even heard of him. But there's a lot to be said about President Polk. And Jeb Bush fell over laughing and then started discussing with my daughter all the great reasons why President Polk was a fantastic president. And it was very funny. It was very momentous for me. So.
That's a great story, Neil. Next question. There's two similar ones. Will voting by mail replace in-person voting in November? And then if you could just talk a little bit more about your thoughts on that regarding mail-in voting.
So there's a lot to this. So first of all, it's going to change the turnout numbers. And so one party or the other may say, we don't want that kind of thing, because then more people will vote and we get more strength when we get less people voting. The fact is that now remember that elections are controlled by the states. So it's up to the state of New Hampshire to decide these things, and our Secretary of State. So the President of the United States can make some sort of declaration on this, but our state voting is controlled by the state. And so if the governor of New Hampshire, for example, keeps his emergency orders open, state of emergency open past November, it may create some flexibility for there to be more voting from home. Let me tell you why that can be problematic. In the state of New Hampshire, if you go into the voting booth and you check off who you're voting for and take a selfie with yourself, as we do for many different things, you can be arrested and prosecuted, etc. And in fact, someone last year was prosecuted for this. The reason why is that the Secretary of State does not want your boss, let's say your boss was a big Trump fan, and he says, if you want to have a job here on Wednesday, you need to bring your selfie showing that you voted for President Trump. And so that's why that is a private thing that we do not allow voting, obviously, the pictures in the voting booth of the ballot. There's a lot of history here where people say you're going to go and you're going to vote this way. Think of labor unions, think of teachers unions. And think about this with your own spouse, that many of us may go to the polls with our spouse and say, I'm voting for candidate X, and your spouse says, I am also voting for candidate X, but behind the voting booth, your spouse does the exact opposite. And so when you're voting from home and your spouse is over your shoulder, and your spouse says, oh, you're voting for who? Well, yeah, I want you to vote for this person instead. There's a lot more risk of that kind of thing, or people getting together and saying, our little union is going to get together and we're all going to fill these forms out together. So there's a lot of risk with that kind of voting. Of course, we do have absentee ballots, but you do have to swear that you're not here. And there's other provisions about an absentee ballot. So we will see. Our Secretary of State is sort of made some motions that under a state of emergency that it is acceptable. And so there's a long time, as I mentioned, 29 weeks to go.
Well, thanks, Neil. Next question. A lot of talk about, who Vice President Biden or candidate Biden will select as his vice president. I think the person writes that our current president is anything but predictable. So what are your thoughts on, whether or not President Trump throws a curveball and decides to have someone else as his vice presidential candidate?
Well, I think there's some real factors here in the fact that Vice President Pence, this is, I'm sure, on his mind. And that's why he's gone out to a couple of locations. The president, of course, put him in charge of the task force, which is, of course, risky because if things don't turn out, as we know, the president does seem to turn on some of his advisors. I think he's on his 4th or 5th chief of staff at this point. And that's just the reality. And he's not the only politician that does that. So if this goes sideways and he's got bad numbers from the coronavirus and Pence was the head of the coronavirus task force, that may be a very uncomfortable place for Vice President Pence to be, and he may want to freshen things up. There has been a lot of history books written about all of the times where vice presidents were almost dumped or were dumped leading up to an election. You didn't hear about it because it was pretty tight-lipped at the time, and then you found out about it afterwards. And so I'm sure that some of this is going on, some of the speculation. And if they do polling and Pence is not ranked high, that's trouble for him. I think so far, though, he's pretty much stayed to the script. He is probably the person that's sort of survived the longest in the Trump administration as far as not taking, the Fauci fire, if you will. He's up there at the podium every day, but you don't see the president beating him up at all and never have. So he's doing something right in order to stay in the good graces of the President of the United States.
Great. Neil, the next question is someone has asked if you could run down the list of key battleground states again, and then a follow-up question from a fellow a former NHIOP student ambassador is how are the current student ambassadors doing, and what are you and Ann and Laurie doing to keep them engaged remotely?
That's a great question. So the first thing is Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I actually think that New Hampshire should be probably thrown into that. I think you can win those other states though and lose New Hampshire. So, but I think that those are the states that are on these they're the targets. And so, for example, why does that matter? Well, Harris, you know, she's from California. Biden is going to win California big time. The advantage, of course, is money. There's a lot of Democratic money in California, but she's not from one of these states. As far as the student ambassadors go, we've been doing some Zooms with them, emailing with them, and I'm personally calling a lot of them. We've been doing some committee work with them. It's really hard. It's hard for all of us. I actually sort of get emotional sometimes in these situations. These students are the best part of this institute. They're the best part of my job. And they're so smart and they're so wonderful. And here they are, they've worked so hard, you know, to walk across that quad and to get that diploma, and they can't do it. And they're stuck at home, and they're very positive on these Zoom calls, but it is heartbreaking. And they're obviously 2 months ago, they had their pick of their litter for internships, for jobs, and now who knows? Some of them have been dropped from major news organizations on internships or jobs, and so it's been tough. You know, I'm trying to do what I can to help. I graduated from college into an economy that wasn't this bad, but it was bad, and you get through it. And they're trying to be positive, but it's you know, I've had a couple times where I click, you know, hang up the Zoom call and actually have to sit there and sort of collect myself afterwards. It's probably the only thing I get emotional about in this job.
I hear you, you know, Neil, as a former, like you, a member of the college's senior leadership team, it is definitely the most heartbreaking thing of our jobs. And we are committed to making sure that we will celebrate the class of 2020 in person when it is safe to do so. We a whole bunch more questions just came in.
I'll go faster.
Let me see, Neil, what do you think the turnout for the general election will be? And then who do you think is on the short list of potential women VP running mates for Vice President or candidate Biden?
Okay, I think there could be record turnout because I think people are really civically engaged. The other thing is if you lose your job, or if mom and dad lose their job, or if, God forbid, someone passes away because of this virus, you're going to be motivated and interested in how your government works. And so I think that we'll probably have record turnout. As far as the vice presidential pick, you know, I think the Whitmer, obviously, I think would probably be a front runner. But here's what we don't know. Biden was a vice president. He knows what it takes and what you've got to do. And a lot of that is loyalty, not, you know, getting ahead of your skis, and trying to be a good confidant on some really critical issues. Because the vice president, as in Reagan and Bush, you know, they were adversaries, but then Bush was a major figure in that 8 years of the Reagan administration as a confidant. And I think that Biden probably, a lot of this has to do with things that are unknown to us, which is, what is his personal relationship with a lot of these people that are out there, potential people? He's floated our two New Hampshire U.S. Senators, Hassan and Shaheen. I think he did it because he was facing the New Hampshire primary and was looking to get a little love from that. But the truth is if he has a really good relationship with someone like a Senator Hassan and feels that she would be a qualified person to be president, I think that those are things that we're not necessarily factoring in, is his personal relationship with some of these people. And by the way, Harris is not well loved apparently by Mrs. Biden, a fact that may play into this.
Good to know. Now, next question from Aisling Stanek. Hello, Aisling. New Hampshire is unlike most states during an election cycle do you think the effects of COVID-19 will fundamentally change civic engagements across New Hampshire for better or worse?
I think that people are going to, by the way, thank you, Aisling, one of our great student ambassadors of the past. She left her mark here and is a great person. The fact is that I think that, again, going forward, I think people are going to be much more interested in who gets elected to major offices. And if you feel, for example, that your governor or your U.S. senators are not leading the charge, I think that you're going to be much more interested in elections than you have been in the past. I think that here in New Hampshire, we have a governor that's working 7 days a week. He's shining. And I think that's going to bode well for civic engagement, for example, in the future. I think I answered all that.
Great. Thanks, Neil. The next question, Neil, are there any plans to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Institute? It's hard to believe. I was there the dedication the Friday before 9/11 when the NHIOP was dedicated and the Institute was opened. And if so, how can people get involved?
So we're going to be rolling that out. We've already sort of started the planning. It got sidelined a little bit due to the current situation, but we are going to celebrate the 20th anniversary. As you mentioned, just a few days before September 11th is when the ribbon was cut. Senator Gregg, I've talked to him about it. He, of course, is really the person responsible, along with Father Jonathan, with the creation of this institute. And so we're going to be involving them quite a bit. And Senator Gregg, who's going to be, by the way, doing an event with us next week via Zoom, he is going to be probably playing a major role in what we do on that 20th anniversary. We're doing a podcast with the Business and Industry Association, or not a podcast, but a webinar with Senator Gregg, because he was there when the TARP was passed, when the Treasury Secretary walked into the Bush Oval Office and said, we've got to borrow $40 billion right now with this piece of paper. He was in that room. And he is probably, in my opinion, the biggest, the largest expert on the Congress and the fiscal health of the nation. So he's going to talk about, when you're passing $2 billion pieces of legislation by unanimous consent, that is just unprecedented. And somehow this money will need to get paid back. And so that's kind of going to be the topic. A little bit of a Debbie Downer, I think, a little bit, because we're all looking for, the next check that comes in the mail. But this is going to have a fiscal impact in our country moving forward.
Right. Neil, the next one, this is really an easy question. You have to put your professor hat on. What do you think is the future of the Electoral College? Is it just a vestige of the past? And does it help or hurt New Hampshire?
Great question. I get it all the time when I give speeches to Rotary clubs and senior centers and things like that. So here's the deal. The deal is that in our country right now, we have a hard enough time passing a spending bill with 51 votes in the Senate. The point is that to change the Constitution, to eliminate the Electoral College, if you're a practical person, the chances of that are the same as me also playing for Tampa Bay next fall. The fact is that it's just not going to happen. But there are a lot of people who would like to see it. A lot of people are unhappy because, Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote, but the president of the United States is Donald Trump. But here's the thing. When you're a campaign manager, you have a rule book. That rule book is we need to win 538. Of the 538, we need to win the majority, and I'm going to become president. And that's what the rules are. So in that kind of a situation, the president and the vice president will be campaigning here in a state like New Hampshire. Obviously, we don't have a huge population base. If we eliminated the Electoral College, candidates would go to Los Angeles, New York, Miami, and we wouldn't even be, flown over at this point. But I think the Electoral College, for obvious reasons, is good for New Hampshire. And I expect if this virus sort of goes away enough so that the president's visiting states, that he's definitely going to come to New Hampshire. And I had expected a springtime visit before this all happened.
Great. The next question, a lot of people are focusing on the presidential election in November, but what are your thoughts, Neil, about the races in the House and the Senate? And is there any chance that either the House or the Senate will switch parties?
I think there's definitely a chance of that. I think that anytime there's so much uncertainty and anger out there in the electorate, that we could have flips. And I think that, though, as I mentioned in the first part of this, that incumbents are probably in pretty good shape because a lot of them, their challengers can't get the kind of attention that they would want in order to defeat an incumbent. When I got out of college, I started on a campaign, and we were challenging a sitting member of Congress with a 72% approval rating. And our media guy put together a press conference at the State House, and the candidate we were running against was a flip-flopper. And we wanted to get that out. So we had all the press there, and we hired a gymnast who dressed just like the sitting member of Congress, and he came into the middle of the press conference and started doing somersaults, flip-flopping through the press. Obviously, we got some attention off of that. I think of that now because that's the kind of thing that you can't do if you're challenging an incumbent. And so could we have some flips? Yes. Anything can happen in politics, but I think incumbents are probably in pretty good shape right now.
Great. Thanks, Neil. The next question, a real easy one, Neil. And I'm sorry, I said ahead of time I was not going to filter any of the questions. What is your party affiliation? As a good New Hampshire civically engaged person, I have a feeling I know what your answer is going to be.
Look, I've never said this to anybody in public, but I will. Did I fade in and out?
Yeah. Good.
But you didn't laugh at my Tampa Bay joke, so.
Yeah, Gronk. I know, Gronk.
I come from the Republican side of things, but when you're in the business of politics, it's easy to sort of separate yourself and sort of see both sides. And I criticize and praise both sides frequently. Some people don't like it, but I sort of try to point out what I think a lot of times is obvious information, but a lot of times people don't like to hear that.
Right. And just for the interest of time, we'll probably do one more question, and then Neil, if you want to wrap it up. And before asking the question, Neil, I just, on behalf of the many participants on the call, I just want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this. I hope that I know Patrice, who's done a phenomenal job, Patrice and her team from Alumni Relations. We're going to continue to beg you, and hopefully you'll be able to do these every couple of weeks, and maybe next week, right after you release the poll, would be a great time to do another one. But again, I think I speak for the entire administration, Neil, and thanking you for truly taking one of St. Anselm College's greatest gems really to the next level. So the last question, Neil, you mentioned that New Hampshire may be in play as a swing state in the fall. Do you still believe that New Hampshire is a purple state and can continue to go either way for the foreseeable future? So if you want to answer that, and if you want to wrap it up.
Sure. I definitely think that we're a purple state. Sununu has really, as a Republican, has good numbers right now, but we have 4 members of the delegation, and they're all Democrats. The Senate president, who's an alum of St. Anselm College, is also a Democrat, and the Speaker of the New Hampshire House is a Democrat. So we do sort of have this mixture in the state, and I think that for a long time coming, just the way looking at polling, it's probably going to continue. But if it goes anywhere into one column or the other in the future, probably in the Democratic column. You said this is one great gem. I appreciate that. We work hard at that here. I will say that I think the great gem of St. Anselm College is our alumni and the community that's here. Yesterday, I was on a call with prospective students, and I always say this when I do a tour or I do a Zoom with them, which is, in my 10 years of working here, I've never had a student, never, ever, ever had a student come to me at the end and say, I regret going to St. Anselm College. I didn't like it. In fact, I have quite the opposite. And so it's great to be able to sort of talk to many of you and give you my insights, and hope to do it in the future. And I thank you, Jim and Patrice, and we'll see you again as soon as we have some poll numbers.
Thanks again, Neil. Have a great afternoon, everyone.